There are schools of thought that say that Trump's threats actually help security, that help bring European nations to their senses in paying more as well, that make people realize that uh, there is an unstable world, and that somehow add an unstable world to a chaotic presidency and you actually get something positive out of it. For me, that sounds like a stretch. What I'm seeing in trade certainly is that with the US withdrawing, with the EU pulling back to a certain degree, you're actually leaving global competitiveness to China to take on, and that the US will have to reverse this in time.
25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, 10% on China. He talked about these, didn't he, during the election campaign, Donald Trump? Did you anticipate that they were true plans for Donald Trump and something that he intended to bring in the day he became president once again?
I think we always expected that Trump was serious about tariffs, not necessarily literally what the plans will be, and these aren't necessarily the exact how it will work out. These are slightly different to the plans he said on the campaign trail, where Mexico was going to get 10% along with the rest of the world, and China was going to get 50 or 60%. This is slightly different. They keep varying, but he is serious. He likes tariffs, and we're going to see tariffs from the US in the next 4 years.
Let's take them each country individually. We'll start with China because that's the one that we've been talking about for such a long time on the World in 10. When he talked tariffs with China in his first term, it was about deficits. Not this time, is it? He's changed his tune about really with all three countries, but let's go with them individually.
It is still about the deficit with China. It obviously is as well in this particular case. Talking about fentanyl, that's been an ongoing issue for the US with the China relationship for some time. But it is still about the belief that China is cheating in trade. By importing a lot from China, the US must be losing. That needs to be rebalanced. That's very much at the heart of Donald Trump's thinking. I don't see that changing. But remember, in the end, he did a deal with China first time round. So, though I don't think the thinking will change, we have yet to see, but we expect that he will be open to making deals.
And that fentanyl, that he's talked about with China is also part of his thinking behind these 25% tariffs that he wants to impose on Mexico. He says that a lot of the drugs, these drugs are coming from China through Mexico, but also, about the border once again. He's it's been a focus of his really since day one of his entire political career, right? So was this a natural conclusion in your mind?
Oh, I think that when we were thinking among the trade experts about what Trump would actually do, Mexico was the one country nobody wanted to be in that sort of simulation. There's not just the problems with the border, obviously the fentanyl issue, the fact that Mexico has been building up its manufacturing capability, in some cases with Chinese companies investing in Mexico and then exporting into the US. That was never going to go down well with Trump, even though it was partly a result of the deal he did with Mexico and Canada in his first term of office. So Mexico's always the most vulnerable here. On the other hand, of course, Mexico also is the country that Trump needs to cooperate to control his southern border. So it's not entirely straightforward. So there's a number of different issues come together, including trade and security. So I suspect we'll see a bit of coming and going. This is not going to be a straightforward. I'm putting tariffs on, then we do a deal.
And we'll conclude quickly on this element by talking Canada and the reasoning for them. Again in his first term, it was a job protecting policy when it came to a new deal really with Canada, wasn't it? This time, once again, I sort of struggle to know exactly what they've done. Is it, what are the issues around the border that he's so upset around?
Well, again, there are manufacturers who are based in Canada sending stuff to the US. Canada itself has thought that it could do a separate deal, so they had been speaking about basically jettisoning Mexico and saying, we'll do a bilateral deal. There may also be something personal in this that Trump famously doesn't get on with Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. He's probably on his way out anyway in the next elections. So there may be something political here. But in part, I think that Trump's view is if we're importing cars, that's wrong. And they do import cars from Canada and from Mexico.
Donald Trump isn't someone that usually admits he's wrong, does he? But he signed this USMCA deal, didn't he, in 2018, involving, the effectively free trade of sorts between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Is this a climb down by Donald Trump? Is this him going, I got it wrong? Or is it him just going, look, a lot's happened in 6 years, I need a rethink?
I'd be amazed if Donald Trump said, I was wrong in signing my agreement with Mexico and Canada. I suspect what he will say, if asked to justify this, is that he signed a perfect deal. Biden administration failed to implement it properly, so now he has to return and carry on with his work or something like that. Of course, actually, it will be his deal, and it will be that failed, and it will be that has to be reopened if he deals with these threats, because ultimately he tried to turn round the entire course of the modern economy, which is supply chains, and get them all coming back to the USA. That was never going to happen in Trump 1, and it's not going to happen this time round either, however much disruption he causes.
Now, you've been at the coalface of international trade negotiations, haven't you? So if you are Canada, Mexico, China, maybe even parts of Europe, because the suggestion is this will impact pretty much the whole world if he carries out the threats he has made. What conversations are happening behind the scenes now? What warnings are being put to the US trade negotiators about the impact that this decision might have?
So there is in preparation, I'm quite sure in pretty much every capital around the world is a list of American products that are going to see tariffs on them should the US take action, and they will be seminal products like Harley Davidson, Jack Daniels, various things like that. So that's to be fair, that's the easy part. The next part that's more tricky is then what other stuff can we do that threatens US interests in various ways. Things around services potentially. Maybe we threaten to shut down X stroke Twitter and attack Mr. Musk. On the other hand, then there's also the list that is probably here's the traditional things we can offer, like we can offer the US that will spend more on defense or will spend more on border patrols. And then there's another list, which is the ones for friends and family. Here's the things that we can do personally for Trump. We can, host major golf tournaments or at his premises or whatever it is. So there's all of these different lists in play, I think. And all these countries are just going to, well, actually, I don't think they are going to be issuing warnings to US officials. I think they're going to be trying to keep their heads down and just make it clear that should they get caught up in a Trump tweet, there's a long list of things ways in which they've prepared. But I suspect you don't really want to do it unless you're very confident. There are a couple of people first time around who got away with this. Japan did it very well. Their prime minister went to have dinner at Mar-a-Lago. So they did okay, and the EU finally got its negotiation pretty well. But most countries, I think, hoped to try and avoid Trump in negotiations, basically.
On the surface of it, this is a story about Mexico, Canada, China, and the United States. Why is Germany commenting? Why is it a big story in the UK and in the wider Western world?
We're accustomed to 75 years of the US helping to build up the global economic system that we have today. And so it is a big deal if the US is threatening to pull back on that. Not only that, but that system is already breaking down with the rise of China. So there's a good deal of uncertainty around the world that we're going into in terms of trade. If the US pulls back, this is something we won't have seen for nearly 100 years. And obviously there's the fear of what happened then with the global depression. I don't think it would be the same now. The world is very different. But that memory as well, when the US pulls back, it's not good news for the rest of the world. If you're Germany, you have a huge trade surplus with the US. and you may be next in the firing line. Less so if you're the UK, but if you're the UK, you've spent all this time wanting to be an Atlantic bridge to trade with both US and EU, and suddenly that's not looking so easy. So everybody, all the traditional allies of the US have an interest in this, and just as I say, the history of it, that this does look like a historic pullback by the US. That's got to be a big deal.
Do you think he'll actually do this? Do you think that what he has suggested overnight on Truth Social is what ends up coming to fruition, or will there be enough pushback that he'll come? I don't want to say come to his senses. It's not for me to judge that, but that, in the minds of those that are upset about it, come to his senses.
What I'm expecting is that there'll be a lot of threats, quite a lot of chaos, some tariffs, some deals, and that it won't quite be the worst, but it won't be great for the global economy either. So basically, somewhere between normality as we've come to experience it and the worst of Trump's plans will be where we land, but that won't be particularly good for anyone, even if we are slightly sighing relief that it could have been worse.
Can we dig a bit into the China situation? Because Trump gets asked about tariffs all the time with China, but there are other issues potentially at play over the course of the next few years. Things like, will China invade Taiwan? Do you think that there's any thought in Trump's mind, look, if I really go for China in the immediate term, then sort of medium and long term, actually the global security situation might be safer, that China will be able to impact less, wars, for example, their support of Russia, their own intentions with Taiwan?
There are schools of thought that say that Trump's threats actually help security, that help bring European nations to their senses in paying more as well, that make people realize that there is an unstable world, and that somehow add an unstable world to a chaotic presidency and you actually get something positive out of it. For me, that sounds like a stretch. What I'm seeing in trade certainly is that with the US withdrawing, with the EU pulling back to a certain degree, you're actually leaving global competitiveness to China to take on, and that the US will have to reverse this in time. Taiwan's obviously a very different issue, but it's not clear really that what the Trump administration's view on China is. As similarly, it's not really clear what the view is on Ukraine. It is hard. We've got a situation where you get posts on the basis of being Trump loyalists, not necessarily for a coherent body of thought. So I think the idea that this all makes us more secure at the end of the day, or that the threats are carried out and the trade system survives, I think that's on the assumption that there's actually a master plan behind it, whereas actually I think it's a Trumpian chaos, it's a court system, and I think that that's the danger, is that you don't quite know where any of that is going, and that's what keeps everyone on their toes, but almost certainly that's not a good outcome.
And of course, in the last week or so, Canada has made this vow, hasn't it, to up its NATO spending to 2% of GDP, but not until 2032. Of course, if these tariffs come in, presumably, I don't know if you can explain the depth at which that might affect a country's GDP. And then in actual physical monetary terms, 2% of that is going to be an awful lot less, which very much goes against what Trump usually would be calling for.
I mean, it's not a direct, if the tariffs go up by 20%, your GDP falls by 5%, but there is an expectation that trade wars are costly for GDP, particularly if the country retaliates, which you're under political pressure to do so. So the chances are that this does hit GDP. The chances are, now it has been argued that some countries might say to Trump, we'll spend more on defense, but we won't be able to afford to do so if you impose tariffs. So in order to do it, please don't impose tariffs. All part of the bargaining that I expect to see in doing so. But yes, I would expect some of the forecasts for growth next year to take account of the fact that tariffs are likely to reduce economic activity, trade wars reduce economic activity.
So, to all intents and purposes, you think, without going so far as to say for sure, that perhaps that this sort of Western security situation that people are very nervous about anyway at the moment is potentially at greater risk by these tariffs than if he doesn't impose them. Is that a fair reflection of what you're saying?
I think in any case, I'm more concerned about the security situation as a result of Trump than I am about the tariff situation. I'm more confident that the global trade system can survive because it's no longer as US centric as at times in the past. I'm more worried about on the security side, and I expect it's just a fragmentation of alliances and of relationships rather than an outright breakage. But it feels to me like that can't be to the advantage of the United States, Europe, the G7 to have this situation of court chaos, if you like, and that must be to the advantage of other countries. That would be my basic view.
Just finally, David, bringing you back to a bit more generally, we've explored some of the potential wider ramifications, I guess, of this. Do you see, from Trump's point of view, that the phrase is America first, make America great again, isn't it, with Donald Trump? Do you see, just in isolation, how this does benefit America? The threat initially, and then potentially the carrying out of these tariffs. Does it truly, or has he missed something, Donald Trump?
There's an argument that says that in the kind of modern interlinked economy, the nation state has been left behind. And that in making these kind of threats and speaking up for the country, it provides something that you don't otherwise get of an element of confidence saying, look, we are still strong players. So, yeah, although we can look at the potential damage to the economy and to security, there is some kind of psyche here, underlying psyche, that does make a certain amount of sense. So I don't want to completely rule it out. I think we see it around the world that this element of, if you like, reasserting some degree of national control over a chaotic global situation, and it does require a Trump-like figure almost to do that, is what we've seen around the world. But usually the cost is much more chaotic, is much worse than the benefit. But I think that we've got to see it in that way, that there is a certain amount of nation building going on here as well.